Dust never truly settles in the Bitterroot Valley. It just waits for the wind to carry the ghosts of 1,878. History books remember Henry Caldwell as a ruthless timber baron, a giant of a man with a temper like a rock slide. What those sterile ledgers fail to mention is the rainy Tuesday in a grim mining camp when he traded a decade's worth of gold for 4 terrified girls shivering on an auction block. They were sold like cattle by their own flesh and blood. Henry didn't buy them to serve him. He bought them to build a dynasty, forging a sanctuary that would eventually bring the harshest men of the frontier to their knees. Rain lashed down on the canvas roofs of Ruby City, a miserable, lawless mining camp where desperate men came to dig their graves in the mud. Inside the Smoky Dog Saloon, the stench of stale whiskey, wet wool, and unwashed bodies hung thick in the air. Henrietta Higgins, known to her family as Hattie, stood on a makeshift wooden platform constructed from overturned whiskey crates. Her hands trembled, though she clamped her jaw shut to hide it. At 20 years old, she was the eldest, fiercely gripping the hands of her younger sisters, 18-year-old Clementine, 16-year-old Beatrice, and little 10-year-old Pearl, whose face was buried in Hattie's skirts. Below them stood their uncle, Jebediah Higgins. Jebediah was a weasel of a man with a rotting smile and a soul blackened by gambling debts. When the girls' parents had perished in a tragic wagon accident crossing the plains a year prior, Jebediah had become their legal guardian. He hadn't taken them in out of familial love. He saw them as assets. Now, owing hundreds of dollars to a vicious saloon owner named Amos Croft, Jebediah had chosen to liquidate those assets. He was auctioning off their labor contracts, a thinly veiled frontier term for indentured servitude that often led to much darker fates for young women in mining camps. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," Jebediah shouted over the raucous laughter of the miners. "Look at the constitution on the eldest. Strong enough to chop wood, pretty enough to keep your hearth warm. And the younger ones? Quick learners. Every single one of them. I'm starting the bidding at $200 for the lot. Who's gonna take these fine young ladies off my hands?" Hattie's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scanned the crowd of leering, filthy men. Some were missing teeth. Others had scars that spoke of violent, ruthless lives. Clementine wept silently, while Beatrice glared with a defiant, terrified fire in her eyes. Hattie knew that if they went to Amos Croft, or any of these miners, they would be separated, abused, or worse. She looked frantically for an escape, but the saloon doors were blocked. "250, shouted a man with a greasy beard and a missing eye. 300, countered a voice from the back, belonging to a sharp-dressed gambler who looked at the girls with a chillingly calculated gaze. Jebediah rubbed his hands together, his greed momentarily overpowering his fear of Amos Croft. 300. I hear 300. Do I hear 4? The saloon doors slammed open with a concussive bang that shook the mud from the floorboards. The wind howled through the entrance, carrying the freezing rain. But the men in the room fell dead silent. Standing in the doorway was a behemoth of a man. He wore a heavy bearskin coat soaked with rain, his face partially obscured by a thick, dark beard and the wide brim of a battered Stetson. A jagged, horrific scar dragged down the left side of his face, disappearing into his collar. He carried a heavy Winchester rifle in his right hand, not pointed at anyone, but held with the casual ease of a man who knew how to use it instantly. This was Henry Caldwell. Henry was a mountain man, a solitary trapper and prospector who lived high up in the crags of the Bitterroots. He was known to come down to Ruby City only twice a year for supplies. He spoke to no one, drank alone, and was rumored to have once killed a grizzly bear with nothing but a hunting knife. People crossed the street when they saw him. His reputation was one of deep, simmering anger. Henry stepped into the saloon, his heavy boots thudding against the planks. The crowd naturally parted for him. He didn't look at the miners, and he didn't look at Amos Croft. His dark, furious eyes locked onto Jebediah Higgins, and then drifted up to the 4 girls trembling on the crates. He saw little Pearl crying into Hattie's dress. For a fraction of a second, something flashed in Henry's eyes, a ghost of a memory, a flash of profound pain before the hard, angry mask slammed back into place. 500, Jebediah stammered, trying to regain the room's attention, though he took a step back from the approaching giant. "Do I hear 500? Henry stopped right in front of the platform. He reached inside his heavy coat. Men in the saloon instinctively reached for their sidearms, expecting a shootout. Instead, Henry pulled out a heavy, dirt-stained leather pouch. He tossed it through the air. It hit Jebediah square in the chest with a heavy, metallic thud, knocking the smaller man backward into the mud-caked floor. Jebediah scrambled to catch the pouch, loosening the leather drawstrings. Several massive, raw gold nuggets tumbled out into his greedy palms. The room collectively gasped. There was easily $2,000 worth of pure mountain gold in that bag. "They're mine," Henry growled. His voice sounded like grinding stones, deep and rusty from disuse. Jebediah looked up, his eyes wide with shock and sudden wealth. "Mr. Caldwell, this is more than enough. The girls are yours. All of them." Henry didn't say another word to the uncle. He turned his scarred face up toward Hattie. Hattie felt a fresh wave of terror wash over her. They had just been bought by the most frightening man in the territory. A man whispered to be a savage. "Get your things," Henry commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We ride before the mud freezes." Hattie swallowed hard, pulling Pearl closer. "We don't have things, mister. Just what we're wearing." Henry grunted, a harsh sound of disapproval that made Clementine flinch. He turned on his heel and marched toward the door, turning his head slightly, then walk. Leaving Ruby City was a silent, tense affair. Henry had purchased 3 sturdy mules from the livery stable, loading them with flour, salt, coffee, and heavy wool blankets. He hoisted little Pearl onto the gentlest mule, a roan with sad eyes, and motioned for Beatrice and Clementine to ride the other 2. Hattie, determined not to show weakness, insisted on walking alongside Henry's massive black stallion. The trail up into the Bitterroot Mountains was treacherous. By the time they reached the timberline, the rain had turned into a biting sleet. Hattie's thin leather shoes were soaked through, her feet numb blocks of ice. She kept her eyes fixed on the broad, bearskin-clad back of the mountain man leading them. Henry hadn't spoken a single word since they left the saloon. He simply rode forward, his posture rigid, radiating an intense, unapproachable anger. Hattie's mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Why had this solitary, furious man spent a fortune on 4 young women? The rumors about Henry Caldwell were dark. Some said he was an outlaw hiding from the hangman's noose. Others claimed he had lost his mind to the isolation. Hattie quietly slipped a sharp, broken piece of flint into her apron pocket. If he tried to lay a hand on her sisters, she swore to herself she would drive it into his neck, even if it cost her own life. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Henry finally called a halt in a sheltered grove of massive ponderosa pines. He dismounted with surprising grace for a man of his size and began violently chopping deadwood with a heavy axe. His movements were fueled by a strange, restless fury. Every swing seemed to be an attack on the wood itself. The girls huddled together under a rocky overhang, shivering violently. Clementine rubbed Pearl's hands, trying to blow warmth into them, but the little girl's lips were turning blue. Hattie watched Henry build a massive fire, the flames roaring to life and casting long, dancing shadows against the trees. Henry turned and looked at the shivering huddle of girls. He scowled, his scarred face looking absolutely demonic in the firelight. He marched over to his pack, ripped out 3 thick, dry woolen blankets, and threw them at Hattie's feet. "Wrap the little one," he barked. Hattie hesitated, then quickly picked up the blankets, wrapping them tightly around Pearl and Clementine. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." Henry didn't acknowledge her thanks. He went back to his saddlebags and pulled out a heavy iron skillet, a slab of salted pork, and a tin of beans. He cooked in silence, the sizzling fat smelling like heaven to the starving girls. When the food was ready, he didn't serve them. He simply set the skillet on a flat rock near them, dropped 4 tin forks beside it, and walked away with his rifle, disappearing into the dark tree line. "Is he leaving us?" Beatrice whispered, her teeth chattering. "No," Hattie said, keeping her voice steady, though her hands shook as she handed the first forkful of pork to Pearl. "He wouldn't spend that much gold just to leave us to the wolves. Eat. We need our strength." They ate ravenously, scraping the iron skillet clean. An hour later, Henry emerged from the darkness. He walked past them without a word, laying his own bedroll on the cold, damp ground on the far side of the fire, purposely putting himself between the girls and the open trail. He slept with his hand on his Winchester. It was on the third day of the climb that Hattie realized Henry's anger might not be directed at them. The trail had narrowed to a frighteningly thin ledge overlooking a massive gorge. The wind was howling, a bitter gale that threatened to push them over the edge. Pearl's mule stumbled on a loose rock. The animal let out a panicked bray, its hind legs slipping off the side of the trail. Pearl screamed, clinging to the saddle horn, as the mule tipped precariously over the abyss. Pearl, Hattie shrieked, lunging forward, but she was too far away. Before anyone could blink, Henry threw himself from his stallion. He didn't hesitate or calculate the risk. He dove toward the edge, grabbing the mule's thick leather halter with his left hand and wrapping his massive right arm around little Pearl's waist. The sheer weight of the falling mule threatened to drag Henry down with it. The veins in his thick neck bulged, his boots grinding into the dirt as he fought gravity. With a roar of pure, primal exertion, he hoisted Pearl upward, tossing her safely onto the solid path into Hattie's waiting arms. Then, drawing his hunting knife in a blur of motion, Henry slashed the saddle straps. The saddle, along with half their supplies, fell away, lightening the mule just enough. Henry hauled the terrified animal back onto the ledge, collapsing onto his back, chest heaving. Hattie fell to her knees, hugging Pearl tightly, tears streaming down her face. She looked at Henry. The mountain man's hands were bleeding where the leather had ripped his skin, but he didn't check his own wounds. He sat up and immediately looked at Pearl, his rough chest rising and falling. "Is she hurt?" he demanded, his voice louder than usual over the wind. "No," Hattie choked out. "She's safe. You saved her. You saved her life." Henry turned his face away, hiding the scarred side. "Keep her toward the wall. Trail's weak here." He stood up, ignoring his bleeding hands, and went to calm his stallion. Hattie watched him, the broken flint in her pocket suddenly feeling very heavy and foolish. The man was terrifying. Yes, he was loud, angry, and rough. But as he wiped the blood from his hands onto his trousers and checked the girth on Beatrice's mule, Hattie realized something profound. Henry Caldwell wasn't a predator. He was a protector, and whatever had scarred his face had left much deeper wounds on his soul. On the afternoon of the 5th day, they crested the final ridge. The storm broke, revealing a valley of breathtaking, untouched beauty. Surrounded by jagged, snow-capped peaks, a crystal-clear lake reflected the fading afternoon sun. At the edge of the timberline stood Henry's home. It was a rough-hewn log cabin, functional but utterly devoid of comfort. The roof was covered in sod, and the mud chinking between the logs was crumbling in places. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness. There was one heavy wooden table, a single chair, a massive stone fireplace, and a cot in the corner. Animal traps hung from the walls alongside stretched pelts. It was the den of a man who only used it to survive the winter, not a place to live. Henry ushered them inside. The girls stood awkwardly in the center of the one-room cabin, feeling impossibly out of place in their tattered city dresses among the bear skulls and heavy iron tools. "You take the bed," Henry said gruffly, pointing to the single cot. "I'll sleep in the lean-to with the horses." "Mr. Caldwell, we couldn't possibly," Hattie began. "I said what I said," Henry interrupted, his voice booming. He saw Clementine flinch and immediately lowered his tone, grinding his jaw. "I don't sleep well under a roof anyway. Firewood's out back. River's 50 paces east. Don't go wandering. There's cougars." With that, he grabbed a heavy canvas tarp and walked out the door, leaving them alone. The first week was a strange, silent dance of boundaries. The girls immediately went to work transforming the masculine space. Clementine, who had learned a great deal from their late mother, found wild mint and yarrow near the river and scrubbed the cabin floors until they smelled fresh. Beatrice learned to chop the firewood, finding an outlet for her own anger in the swing of the axe. Hattie took over the cooking, managing to turn Henry's basic rations into stews and biscuits that made the mountain man pause after his first bite. Henry kept his distance. He hunted from dawn until dusk, bringing back elk meat, wild turkeys, and fresh trout. He would drop the game at the door, chop massive piles of wood, and retreat to his lean-to. He never intruded on their privacy, but the harsh reality of the mountains was unforgiving. 2 weeks into their stay, the temperature dropped suddenly, bringing an unseasonable blizzard, and little Pearl fell ill. It started as a cough, but by nightfall, she was burning with a terrifying fever. Her breath rattled in her small chest, and she tossed and turned on the cot, crying out for her dead mother. Clementine applied cold compresses and brewed yarrow tea, but nothing broke the fever. By midnight, Hattie was in a panic. She threw a shawl over her shoulders and ran out into the howling blizzard, forcing her way into Henry's lean-to. He was awake, sitting in the dark, carving a piece of pine. "It's Pearl," Hattie cried over the wind. "She's burning up. Her breathing is shallow. Clementine says her lungs are filling." Henry dropped the wood. The mask of anger completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. It was a look Hattie had never expected to see on the giant's face. He pushed past her, rushing into the cabin. He knelt beside the cot, his massive hands hovering over the tiny, trembling girl. He listened to her chest, his scarred face grim. "We need a doctor," Hattie sobbed. "But the town is 5 days away. She won't make it. There's no doctor in Ruby City worth a damn anyway," Henry muttered, his voice tight. He stood up, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "Old Man Miller. He lives at the base of the pass. 2 days' ride if the weather is clear. He's a medicine man, traded with the Nez Perce for decades. He has something for the lung fever. But the storm," Beatrice whispered, looking at the windows rattling under the force of the blizzard. Henry didn't answer. He walked to the wall, grabbing his heaviest winter coat, his snowshoes, and a lantern. "You can't go out in this," Hattie said, grabbing his arm. For the first time, she touched him. His arm was like solid oak under his coat. "It's suicide, Henry. The snow is already waist-deep in the drifts." Henry looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes. "Keep her warm. Boil water to keep the air moist in here." "Henry, please," Hattie pleaded, realizing she was begging the man she had feared just weeks ago not to leave them. "I won't let another one die," Henry whispered, his voice cracking. "I won't." He pulled away, stepping out into the white abyss of the storm. The door slammed shut behind him. For 2 agonizing days and nights, the girls kept vigil. Clementine worked tirelessly, boiling pots of water to create steam to help Pearl breathe. Hattie sat by the window, staring out into the unrelenting whiteouts, praying for the gruff giant who had bought their lives. During the second night, while searching for an extra blanket in a heavy wooden chest Henry kept under a floorboard, Hattie found a small, rusted tin box. It wasn't locked. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a tintype photograph. It was slightly singed at the edges. Hattie held it to the lantern light. The photo showed a younger Henry, his face unscarred, a gentle, wide smile on his lips. Beside him stood a beautiful woman with dark hair, and in Henry's arms was a little girl, no older than 5, with bright, laughing eyes. Underneath the photo was a small, folded piece of paper, a death certificate from a settlement down in the valley, dated 5 years ago. Cause of death: cabin fire. Hattie covered her mouth to stifle a gasp. The anger, the isolation, the horrific scar. Henry Caldwell wasn't a monster who hated the world. He was a broken man who hadn't forgiven himself for failing to save his family from the flames. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally died down. The cabin door shoved open, pushing a massive drift of snow into the room. Henry stood in the doorway. He looked like a walking corpse. Frost coated his beard and eyebrows. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and he was shaking so violently he could barely stand. But in his frostbitten hand, he clutched a small glass vial filled with a dark amber liquid. He stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside Pearl's bed, holding the vial out to Clementine. 5 drops, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. In water. Every hour. Then, The giant mountain man collapsed face first onto the wooden floor, completely unconscious. Over the next week, the roles reversed. While Clementine administered the medicine that miraculously cleared Pearl's lungs, Hattie nursed Henry. He had severe frostbite on his hands and cheeks, and a raging fever of his own from the exposure. Hattie sat by his side in the lean-to since he flatly refused to take the cot even in his delirium, wiping his brow and forcing broth past his cracked lips. During his fever dreams, he would thrash and yell, "Martha, get the baby. The beam is falling. Martha." Hattie would hold his massive, scarred hands, speaking to him in soft, soothing tones until the nightmares passed. Through the crucible of sickness, the invisible wall between the mountain man and the four sisters began to crumble. When Henry finally recovered enough to sit by the fire, the dynamic in the cabin had fundamentally shifted. Little Pearl, fully recovered, no longer hid from him. One evening, as he sat whittling by the hearth, she crawled up onto the stump beside him and rested her head on his heavy arm. Henry stiffened, terrified to move, before slowly, tentatively, resting his large hand on her head. Hattie watched from the stove, a warm smile touching her lips. But peace in the Bitterroots is often an illusion. Down in Ruby City, Jebediah Higgins had drunk his way through the gold Henry had given him. Desperate for more, he began asking questions about the scarred mountain man. It didn't take long for the saloon gossips to spill the rumors. Henry Caldwell wasn't just a trapper. He had staked a claim deep in the valley years ago, a vein of quartz running so rich with gold it was said you could carve it with a pocket knife. Jebediah, flanked by Amos Croft and 3 heavily armed thugs, looked up toward the snow-capped peaks. He realized he hadn't just sold his nieces to a mountain man. He had sold them to a millionaire, and he fully intended to go up there and renegotiate the terms of his guardianship, with bullets if necessary. Meanwhile, up in the high valley, Henry stepped out of his cabin one morning, looking at the 4 girls laughing as they washed clothes by the river. He looked at his small, cramped, rotting cabin. He thought of the impending winter, and the thugs he knew would eventually come looking for his gold. Henry Caldwell walked to his shed, bypassing his hunting tools, and picked up a heavy, 2-man crosscut saw and a set of architectural drafting tools he hadn't touched in 5 years. If he was going to protect these girls, a rotting cabin wouldn't do. He was going to build them a fortress. Spring broke over the Bitterroots with a sudden, violent thaw, turning the mountain streams into roaring torrents. Henry wasted no time. The morning after he pulled his rusted drafting tools from the old trunk, he cleared the massive oak table in the center of the cabin. Where there had once been animal traps and blood-stained skinning knives, there were now sprawling sheets of heavy parchment, meticulously marked with charcoal lines, elevations, and load-bearing calculations. Hattie walked into the cabin holding a basket of gathered wild onions, stopping dead in her tracks. Henry was leaning over the table, a compass in his scarred hand, his eyes possessing a sharp, focused clarity she had never seen before. "I thought you were a trapper," Hattie said softly, setting the basket near the hearth. Henry didn't look up, but his hand paused. "A man can be many things, Henrietta. Before the war, before the gold, I was an apprentice draftsman for Richard Morris Hunt back east. I helped design stone mansions for railroad tycoons in New York." Hattie stepped closer, her eyes scanning the complex architectural drawings. They depicted a sprawling 2-story fortress. It wasn't a log cabin. The walls were marked to be 3 feet thick. "Wood burns," Henry stated, his voice tight, the memory of his tragic past shadowing his words. He finally looked up at her, the jagged scar catching the morning light. "I brought my wife, Martha, and my little girl out here to escape the filth of the city. I built them a fine timber house, and when a spark caught the dry pine roof while I was out checking the trap lines, it took less than 20 minutes to turn to ash." Hattie felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing the edge of the parchment. "And this will be granite," Henry vowed, his jaw set like iron. "Basalt foundation, slate roof imported from the railhead in Missoula. It will not burn, it will not fall, and no man, no matter how many guns he brings, will be able to kick the door in." Building a stone manor in the remote Montana wilderness was a fool's errand, a logistical nightmare that would have broken a lesser man. But Henry Caldwell was fueled by a fierce, protective obsession. The dynamic of their isolated family shifted dramatically. They were no longer captives of the mountain. They were a crew. Henry located a massive outcropping of gray granite a quarter-mile from the building site. Using black powder, he blasted the rock into manageable chunks. Every morning, the valley echoed with the rhythmic clack-clink of hammer and chisel. Henry taught 16-year-old Beatrice how to mix the mortar, finding that the fiery teenager had a natural, methodical rhythm for the grueling work. Clementine, with her softer touch, took over the interior wood detailing, learning to carve intricate mortise and tenon joints for the heavy oak support beams. Little Pearl became the sight runner, fetching water and carrying tools, her laughter bouncing off the rising stone walls. Hattie became the foreman of their survival. She managed the dwindling supplies, tended to the garden they had carved from the tough soil, and hunted small game with a lightweight repeating rifle Henry had taught her to fire. More importantly, she managed Henry. The mountain man pushed himself to the brink of exhaustion daily. His hands bled, his muscles trembled, and his temper would flare when a stone wouldn't sit flush. It was Hattie who would step into his line of fire. She would walk onto the scaffolding, place a cool, damp cloth on the back of his sun-baked neck, and hand him a tin cup of fresh water. "The mountain isn't going anywhere, Henry," she would tell him, her voice a calm anchor in his tempest. One sweltering July evening, after laying the final keystone above the massive, arched entryway, Henry collapsed onto a pile of unused timber. He was covered in gray dust, sweat tracking through the grime. Hattie sat beside him, handing him a plate of roasted venison. He took the plate but didn't eat. He stared at the imposing structure. It was beautiful in a rugged, brutalist way. The Caldwell Keep, as Beatrice had playfully dubbed it, looked as though it had grown naturally out of the mountain itself. "It's nearly done," Henry murmured. He turned his head to look at Hattie. The harsh lines of his face had softened over the months. The manic anger that had defined him in Ruby City was gone, replaced by a quiet, steadfast strength. "You'll be safe here, even when I'm gone." Hattie's heart seized. "Gone? Where are you going?" "My gold claim is tapped out," Henry lied, though Hattie didn't know it yet. "I'll need to head further north before winter to trap. You girls have the house. You have provisions. You have the deed I filed in Missoula under your name." Hattie set her own plate down, turning to face him fully. She didn't care about the dirt or the sweat. She reached up, her soft hand cupping the scarred side of his face. Henry flinched, instinctively trying to pull away from his own perceived ugliness, but Hattie held firm. "You bought us to save us," Hattie whispered fiercely, her eyes searching his. "You built a fortress with your bare hands so we could sleep without fear. If you think for 1 second, Henry Caldwell, that we are letting you walk away into the snow alone, you are a bigger fool than my uncle." Henry stared at her, his breath catching in his throat. For 5 years, he had believed he was a monster, meant for the dark. As Hattie leaned in and pressed her lips softly against his, tasting salt and stone dust, the last remnants of the angry mountain man finally shattered. He wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her against his chest, holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Autumn swept through the valley, turning the aspen leaves into a sea of brilliant gold and warning of the deep freeze to come. The stone house was finished. Its thick walls retained the heat of the massive central hearth, and the heavy oak doors, reinforced with iron bands, stood resolute against the biting wind. It was on a crisp Tuesday morning in late October that the ghosts of Ruby City finally caught up to them. Henry was on the roof, securing the final row of imported slate, when he caught a flash of sunlight glinting off metal near the tree line. He pulled his brass spyglass from his coat pocket and extended it. A mile down the trail, 5 men were making their way up the ridge. Leading them was Amos Croft, the saloon owner, riding a large bay horse. Beside him, looking miserable and terrified, was Jebediah Higgins. Trailing behind were 3 hired guns, hard-bitten men wearing long dusters, armed with heavy repeating rifles. "Hattie!" Henry roared, his voice booming across the valley. He scrambled down the wooden ladder with terrifying speed. "Get the girls! Inside the house!" Now, Hattie dropped the bucket of water she was carrying, and sprinted toward the river where Beatrice and Clementine were washing clothes. The panic in Henry's voice was unmistakable. By the time the girls reached the heavy front doors, Henry was pulling crates of ammunition and his Winchester from the old cabin. "What is it?" Beatrice demanded, breathless. "Your uncle," Henry growled, shoving the girls inside the dark, cool interior of the stone house. "And Amos Croft. They brought guns." He slammed the massive oak doors shut, dropping a heavy iron crossbar into place with a resounding clunk. The house immediately felt like a tomb. Narrow vertical windows designed specifically as embrasures for shooting let in thin slivers of light. "Hide in the cellar," Henry ordered, throwing a box of shells onto the heavy dining table. "Lock the grate from the inside. Do not come up, no matter what you hear. We aren't leaving you to fight 5 men alone," Hattie cried, grabbing her lightweight rifle. "This isn't a debate, Henrietta." Henry barked, locking a shell into the chamber of his Winchester. But before he could push them toward the cellar, a voice echoed from outside. "Henry Caldwell," Amos Croft yelled. He was standing safely behind a massive pine tree, about 50 yards from the front door. "We know about the quartz vein, Mountain Man, and Jebediah here says you stole his legal wards. We represent the law. The law in Ruby City is decided by whoever pours the whiskey. Croft." Henry yelled back through the narrow window slot. "Be reasonable, Caldwell." Jebediah's weaselly voice trembled through the crisp air. "Just hand over the girls and the deed to the claim. We'll let you walk away." Henry looked at Hattie, his eyes cold and dark. He leveled his rifle through the stone slot. "The girls are legally emancipated. Higgins, I have the paperwork filed in Missoula. Now get off my land before I fertilize the pines with you." A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the whistling wind. Then, a gunshot shattered the peace. A heavy bullet slammed into the stone right next to Henry's window, sending a spray of granite chips into the room. One sliced Henry's cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. Fire at will. Amos Croft screamed from the trees. The valley erupted into a deafening roar of gunfire. The 3 hired men opened fire with their repeaters, peppering the front of the house. But Henry's design proved its worth instantly. The heavy lead bullets simply sparked and flattened against the impenetrable 3-foot-thick granite walls. The reinforced oak door barely shuddered under the impact. Henry remained perfectly calm. He took a breath, lined up his sights through the narrow embrasure, and squeezed the trigger. His Winchester barked. One of the hired guns, who had stepped out from behind a rock to reload, grabbed his thigh with a scream and went down, rolling into the brush. "Keep your heads down," Henry yelled to the girls, chambering another round. Hattie didn't go to the cellar. She crept to the adjacent window, resting her smaller rifle on the stone ledge. Beatrice, refusing to cower, grabbed Henry's heavy hunting pistol from the table and knelt behind a thick stone column. For 20 minutes, a fierce stalemate raged. Croft's men poured lead into the unyielding stone, growing increasingly frustrated. Henry fired sparingly, pinning them down with terrifying accuracy. Realizing their rifles were useless against the fortress, Amos Croft grew desperate. "Cover me!" he roared to his remaining men. Croft dashed from the trees, zigzagging wildly toward the front of the house. In his hand, he held a bundle of dynamite, its fuse sparking and smoking fiercely. He intended to blow the heavy oak doors off their iron hinges. "Henry, he has powder," Hattie screamed, her hands shaking as she tried to track the running man. Henry tracked Amos through the narrow slot, but the angle was terrible. If Amos reached the blind spot directly in front of the door, he could set the charge and blow them all to hell. Without hesitating, Henry unbarred the heavy door. "Henry, no!" Hattie shrieked. He threw the door open, exposing himself to the open air. The hired guns immediately fired. A bullet tore through the fleshy part of Henry's left shoulder, spinning him backward, but he didn't fall, gritting his teeth through the blinding pain. Henry brought his Winchester up with one arm. Amos Croft was 20 feet away, rearing his arm back to throw the dynamite. Henry didn't aim for Amos. He aimed for the hissing, sparking fuse. He fired. The bullet clipped the explosive bundle perfectly. The dynamite detonated in Amos Croft's hand with a concussive roar that shook the earth. A shockwave of dirt, smoke, and debris blasted into the house, knocking Henry off his feet and sending Hattie tumbling backward. Outside, a thick cloud of dust hung over the yard. Where Amos Croft had been standing, there was only a smoking crater. The surviving hired guns, witnessing the horrific obliteration of their employer, and facing an impenetrable fortress guarded by a giant who couldn't be killed, threw down their rifles. They scrambled over the rocks, fleeing blindly back down the mountain trail, leaving their wounded companion behind. Jebediah Higgins stood alone by the tree line, his face ashen, his knees knocking together. He looked at the smoking crater, then up at the doorway. Henry stepped out of the smoke, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood soaking his shirt. But his right hand held the Winchester steady, pointed dead at Jebediah's chest. Behind him, Hattie stepped out, her own rifle raised, her eyes blazing with a fury that matched the mountain man's. "Run," Henry rasped, his voice echoing off the high peaks. Jebediah didn't need to be told twice. The cowardly uncle turned and ran, fleeing into the unforgiving wilderness without a horse, a coat, or supplies a death sentence in the Bitterroots in late October. Henry watched him go until the adrenaline finally abandoned him. The rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering against the stone steps, and his massive legs buckled. "Henry!" And Hattie screamed, dropping her gun and catching his good arm before he could hit the ground. Beatrice and Clementine rushed out, grabbing his heavy frame, their combined strength barely enough to haul the bleeding giant back inside the sanctuary he had built for them. Blood stained the freshly laid hearthstones. Hattie tore her apron into strips with frantic, bloody hands, while Clementine boiled water in the heavy iron kettle. Henry lay on the massive oak dining table, his breathing ragged, his face pale beneath the grime and gunpowder residue. The bullet was lodged deep in his shoulder muscle, dangerously close to the bone. "I have to dig it out," Clementine whispered, her hands shaking as she held a pair of long, iron forceps sterilized in the fire. "If it stays, the blood poisoning will take him. Do it," Henry rasped. He looked past Clementine, his dark, tired eyes locking onto Hattie. "Hold my good hand. Henrietta, don't let me move." Hattie gripped his massive right hand with both of hers, leaning her weight over him. She nodded to her sister. Clementine took a deep breath, steadying her hands with a sheer force of will that belied her 18 years, and probed the wound. Henry's entire body went rigid. A low, guttural groan vibrated in his chest, and his grip on Hattie's hands was like a steel vice, nearly crushing her fingers. But Hattie didn't flinch. She leaned closer, resting her forehead against his sweaty temple, murmuring prayers and reassurances until she heard the distinct, sickening clink of lead dropping into a tin basin. "Got it." Clementine sobbed in relief, immediately packing the wound with yarrow and binding it tightly with the linen strips. For 3 weeks, Henry hovered in a feverish haze. Outside, the Bitterroot winter arrived with a vengeance. Blizzards buried the valley under 10 feet of snow, sealing the granite fortress off from the rest of the world. But inside, Henry's architectural masterpiece proved its worth. The 3-foot-thick stone walls held the heat of the massive central fireplace perfectly. The wind howled, but the heavy timbers didn't so much as creak. It was during these quiet, snow-locked months that the true healing began. Hattie rarely left Henry's side. As his strength slowly returned, they spent hours talking by the fire. He told her about his life before the tragedy, the bustling streets of New York, the smell of drafting ink, the ambition that had driven him west. Hattie spoke of her parents, the grueling wagon journey, and the terror of being left at the mercy of Jebediah. The shared vulnerability forged an unbreakable bond, a quiet, fierce romance built not on fleeting passion, but on mutual survival and profound respect. On a quiet evening in late January, while Beatrice and Pearl were reading in the loft and Clementine was knitting, Henry sat by the fire, his left arm resting in a sling. He stared into the flames for a long time before looking up at Hattie, who was mending a wool sock. "I lied to you, Henrietta," he said quietly. Hattie stopped sewing, Her heart skipped a beat. About what? When your uncle came up the mountain, he was looking for a gold claim, a quartz vein rich enough to make a man a king. Henry sighed, the sound heavy with old burdens. There is a vein on this property. I found it 5 years ago. But it isn't a mother lode. I mined every ounce of gold out of it in the first 6 months. It took exactly that long to pull out $2,000 worth of nuggets. Hattie stared at him, trying to process his words. $2,000. But, Henry, that's exactly what you threw at Jebediah in the saloon. Henry nodded slowly. It was everything I had in the world. When I walked into Ruby City that day, I was completely broke. I had intended to buy a winter's worth of flour and salt and disappear into the high timber for good. But then I saw you on that block. I saw Pearl crying. He looked down at his scarred, calloused hands. I couldn't walk away. I traded the last of my gold for your lives. When I brought you here, I had nothing left but an empty mine and a rotting cabin. Tears welled in Hattie's eyes. She crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, resting her hands on his knee. You spent your entire fortune on us. But then, why build this house? Why file the deed in Missoula if the land is worthless? A slow, shrewd smile spread across Henry's scarred face, the smile of a master architect who had laid a perfect foundation. Because the land isn't worthless, Hattie, Henry murmured, leaning forward. When I was drafting mansions for railroad tycoons back east, I learned how they think. I learned how to read survey maps. This valley, this exact pass we are sitting in, is the lowest, most stable grade through the entire Bitterroot Range. Hattie's eyes widened as the realization hit her. The Northern Pacific Railway is pushing west from Helena, Henry explained, his voice vibrating with quiet triumph. They are desperately looking for a route to the coast. Governor Benjamin Potts himself has been offering bounties for a viable pass. They can't go north because of the ice, and the southern passes are too steep for heavy freight. Henry tapped the floor with his boot. They have to come right through our front yard. I didn't file a deed for a gold mine, Hattie. I filed a homestead claim for the water rights, the timber rights, and the sole right of way through this pass. And I put the deed in your name. He reached out with his good hand, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. I didn't just build you a house. I built a toll gate. And when the snow melts, we are going to make history. Spring arrived in 1879 with the deafening crack of melting ice and the roar of swollen rivers. The granite fortress stood resolute, a monument of survival against the vibrant green backdrop of the awakening valley. In early May, riders approached the keep, but they weren't hired thugs or desperate miners. They were men in tailored wool suits, flanked by a surveyor team carrying heavy brass transits. They rode under a white flag of truce, stopping respectfully at the edge of the property line. Henry and Hattie walked out to meet them, standing shoulder to shoulder on the front steps. Henry carried no rifle. His mere presence, the sheer size of him, and the imposing stone fortress behind him were intimidation enough. The lead rider tipped his bowler hat. Mr. Caldwell? Miss Higgins? I am Arthur Penhaligon, Chief Legal Counsel for the Northern Pacific Railway. We encountered some difficulty finding this place. We were warned in Ruby City that this land was guarded by an army. Just a family, Mr. Penhaligon, Hattie said smoothly, her voice carrying the refined authority of a woman who knew her exact worth. State your business. Penhaligon cleared his throat, clearly unsettled by the scarred giant and the steely young woman. We have surveyed the region. It appears, remarkably, that your property line stretches directly across the only viable grade for our transcontinental line. We are prepared to offer you a very generous sum for the right-of-way, $10,000. Henry didn't blink. He looked at Hattie. She gave a barely perceptible shake of her head. Mr. Penhaligon, Hattie said, stepping forward. My husband, she paused, squeezing Henry's hand, a declaration they had made to each other just days prior, and I are not interested in a lump sum. This pass is the key to the Pacific. You need our timber for your ties, and our water for your steam engines. Penhaligon frowned. What are you proposing, Mrs. Caldwell? We retain ownership of the land, Hattie stated clearly. You will lease the right-of-way. We want a royalty of 10 cents for every ton of freight that crosses our property, indefinitely. Furthermore, the Northern Pacific will construct a permanent station at the base of this valley, and my sisters will be granted fully funded shares in the company's regional expansion. The lawyer choked, his face turning an angry shade of purple. That is highway robbery. That is a king's ransom. The railroad will never agree to such extortion. We could seize this land through eminent domain. Henry took one heavy step forward. His voice, deep and resonant, echoed off the stone walls. You try to seize this land, Arthur, and I will show you why Amos Croft is fertilizing the pines down the trail. I built this house to withstand a siege. I can hold this pass until your investors go bankrupt waiting for a route. You pay the toll, or you build your railroad around the Rocky Mountains. The standoff lasted for a tense minute. But the surveyor behind Penhaligon whispered furiously into the lawyer's ear, confirming what Henry already knew. There was no other way through. Defeated, Penhaligon pulled a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. Within a month, the contracts were signed, notarized by a territorial judge in Missoula. The wealth that flowed into the Caldwell family was staggering, but it did not corrupt them. They remembered the mud of Ruby City and the cold of the trail. The sisters, armed with limitless resources, became formidable figures in their own right. Beatrice, whose fiery temperament was channeled into ambition, traveled east. She attended a prominent university and became one of the first female structural engineers in the country, designing steel-arch bridges for the very railroad that crossed their land. Clementine used her shares to fund the construction of a state-of-the-art hospital in Missoula. Remembering the night she dug a bullet out of Henry's shoulder with fire tongs, she ensured that no one in the territory, regardless of their ability to pay, would ever lack proper medical care. Little Pearl grew up exploring the vast, untouched wilderness behind the fortress. She became a renowned botanist, cataloging hundreds of species of mountain flora and eventually pushing the state government to establish the valley as a protected wildlife preserve. As for Jebediah Higgins, the frontier dispensed its own justice. He was found raving mad and half-frozen near Lolo Pass by a fur trapper. He survived, but lost 3 toes, and his mind, spending the rest of his days locked in a territorial asylum, muttering to the walls about a scarred giant and a fortress of stone. Henry and Hattie remained in the keep. They never built a mansion in the city. They didn't need to. They had their fortress. Over the years, the sounds of hammers and chisels were replaced by the laughter of their own children, running through the grand stone halls. Henry's anger, the furious shield he had worn for so long, melted away entirely, replaced by a deep, unwavering peace. The story of Henry Caldwell and the Higgins sisters remains one of the most remarkable legends of the American West. Today, the granite structure known as the Sisters' Keep still stands high in the Bitterroot Mountains, a registered historical landmark. Its 3-foot-thick walls remain untouched by fire, time, or the elements, overlooking the rusted rails of the old Northern Pacific Line. It serves as a permanent testament to the fact that family is not defined by blood, but by the lengths we will go to protect one another. Henry Caldwell, a man broken by tragedy and feared by all, didn't just buy 4 girls to save them from a cruel uncle. He bought them to save his own soul. In the end, he built a fortress of stone, but it was the unbreakable foundation of love, resilience, and unyielding loyalty that truly made history.